Greetings. Today we're going to be doing Lecture 4, Species Interactions and Community Ecology. So this chapter will help students compare and contrast the major types of species interactions, characterize feeding relationships and energy flow, using them to construct trophic levels and food webs, distinguishing characteristics of a keystone species, characterizing disturbance, succession, and notions of community change, perceive and predict the potential impacts of invasive species in communities, explain the goals and the methods of restoration ecology, and describe biomes and identify the terrestrial biomes of the world. So we're going to begin with another central case study, and this one's going to be called Black and White, and the spread all over. Zebra mussels invade the Great Lakes. The pollution-fouled waters of Lake Erie and the other Great Lakes shared by Canada and the United States became gradually cleaner in the years following the Clean Water Act of 1970. Then the zebra mussel, a native to Western Asia and Eastern Europe, arrived by accident in the ballast of warships. By 2010, they had colonized waters in 30 U.S. states. The zebra mussel's larval stage is well adapted for long-distance dispersal and has encountered none of the predators, competitors, and parasites that evolved to limit its population growth in the Old World. Zebra mussels can clog up water intake pipes, damage boat engines, degrade docks, foul fishing gears, and sink buoys the ship used for navigation. They also have severe impacts on the ecological systems they invade, most significantly their consumption of large quantities of phytoplankton needed by the other native mollusks for food. Phytoplankton is the foundation of the Great Lakes food web, so its depletion is bad news for zooplankton, the tiny aquatic animals and protists that eat the phytoplankton, and for the fish that eat both. By filter feeding, zebra mussels clear the water, allowing the community's nutrient balance to shift to the bottom, possibly benefiting species feeding there. And then most recently, the zebra mussel is being displaced by the quagga mussel. Scientists do not yet understand the complex interactions driving the change. However, the quagga have a larger niche in the native mussels and even the zebra mussel. So for species interaction, we can have competition that occurs when resources become limited. When multiple organisms seek the same limited resource, the relationship is said to be one of competition. And we can have an exploitative one, where one species benefits and the other is harmed. And examples of this could be predation, parasitism, and herbivory. But there's also mutualism, a relationship in which both species may benefit. So competitive interactions can take place among members of the same species, and this is called intraspecific competition. And this can often be seen in high population density when there's too much of a single species in one area. Or the other type of competition that can take place is called interspecific, and it's between members of two or more species. And this really just impacts community interactions and various other things we'll talk about in a bit. So if one species is a very effective competitor, it may exclude other species from the resource use entirely, and this outcome is called competitive exclusion. And this is an example of the interspecific competition I was just talking about. But another one, if neither competitor fully excludes the other, the species may continue to live side by side. And this result can be called species coexistence. So the full niche of a species is called its fundamental niche. An individual that plays only part of its role uses only some of its resources because of a competition or other species interactions is said to be displaying a realized niche. So in our little graphic here, in species 1, they have a very large niche, but the realized niche is only the one it can exploit here because parts of its fundamental niche are being taken up by species 2 and 3. So over time, competing species may evolve to use slightly different resources to use their shared resources in different ways, and this is called resource partitioning. And one example is this here on the right is these birds. They all use the same resource of the tree, but they all use it in various different ways. Other examples are using a resource at night and different species using it during the day, and various other examples exist. Here's one. So these finches have different niches where they eat large seeds or small seeds depending on their beak. So no species is excluded until extinction. So over time, competing species may evolve to use slightly different resources. I actually just talked about this. Resource partitioning. Oh, sorry, I went back one. My mistake. So going forward, because species limit their resource use, over time character displacement may occur as they evolve physical characteristics that reflect their reliance on a particular portion of the resource. And that goes back to the last photo we had of the birds, where their physical characteristics reflected the different sizes of seeds they ate. So basically, competition is just reduced when two species become more different. This is what this is saying. So several types of interactions are exploited, and that one type is predation, and it's the process by which an individual of one species, the predator, hunts, captures, kills, and consumes individuals of another species or the prey. Predation can sometimes drive cyclical population dynamics and has evolutionary ramifications. So here's an example. Zebra mussels, they eat the phytoplankton and the zooplankton. Both of these populations will decrease in any lake with zebra mussels. However, zebra mussels won't eat cyanobacteria, so these cyanobacteria will increase. And this is just an example of how predation can control an ecosystem. However, predators can also be prey. The zebra mussels, while they do prey on zoo and phytoplankton, they are eaten by diving ducks and various other aquatic animals. So predator and prey interactions drive cyclical population dynamics. Basically, if prey increase when there's low predators, over time there'll be a large amount of predators, which will cause the prey to decrease, and it's just a cycle that way. And here we have an example. As you see, so the hare are the blue, and when the hare are very large in the beginning, the population is actually in a trough. And then when the lynx increases, shortly thereafter the hare population decreases, the lynx decreases, and so on and so forth. So because of predation, natural selection plays a part in here, and it leads to evolutionary adaptations that make predators better hunters or prey better at not being hunted. So individuals better at catching prey you will usually live longer lives and thus reproduce better and be able to better take care of offspring. And then, as I was saying, prey face strong selection pressures also. So prey will develop elaborate defenses against being eaten. And here's a couple of those, such as cryptic coloration. This gecko, you can barely see him. Warning coloration. Yellow jacket, don't mess with me. And then the mimicry, this is a caterpillar, I believe, and it looks like a snake. So parasites, on the other hand, is another exploitive type of interaction. However, it exploits living hosts, and it's a relationship in which one organism, the parasite, depends on another, the host, for nourishment or some other benefit while doing the host harm. Many types of parasites actually live inside their hosts. However, some are free-living, such as ticks, and some cause disease. These are called pathogens. Here, it appears to be just a fish with a lamprey stuck on it. And the lamprey would be the parasite in this interaction, and the fish would be the host. So many insects parasitize other insects, killing them in the process, and these are called parasitoids. Parasites that cause disease in their hosts are called pathogens again, and coevolution describes a long-term reciprocal process in which two or more types of organisms repeatedly respond by natural selection to others' adaptations. Hosts and parasites often become locked in a duel of escalating adaptations known as the evolutionary arms race, and this is a bit evident in our own evolutionary arms race with the flu. So every year, a new type of flu crops up in response to humans becoming better at defending the old type of flu. Another type of exploitation that we don't really think about maybe is herbivory. And it occurs when animals feed on the tissues of plants. Like animal prey, plants have evolved an impressive arsenal of defenses against animals to feed on them, and some plants even recruit certain animals as allies to assist in their defense. Oh yeah, and one more note, like in parasitism, herbivore-plant interactions can also result in coevolution. So mutualists, on the other hand, they help each other. It's a relationship in which two or more species benefit from interacting with one another. Physically close association is called symbiosis, and symbiosis can either be mutualistic or parasitic. And free-living organisms such as bees and flowers also engage in mutualism in the process of pollination. And here is an example. It's a hummingbird, and it's pollinating this plant by spreading its seed all over. So ecological communities, again, a community is just a variety of populations of organisms living in the same area at the same time. And energy passes through the trophic levels of a community. As organisms feed on one another, matter and energy move through the community from one rank in the feeding hierarchy or trophic level to another. And here's just an example of aquatic and terrestrial examples of different trophic levels. We have detrivores, decomposers, and both producers, primary, all the way up to tertiary consumers. So the first level, the producers, are autotrophs or self-feeders, and these comprise the first level. The next level are the primary consumers, and most primary consumers are herbivores because they consume plants, which are usually the producers. And then the third trophic level consists of secondary consumers, and these just prey on the primary consumers. And then predators that feed at still higher trophic levels are known as tertiary consumers. And secondary and tertiary consumers are carnivores because they eat animals. However, they could also be omnivores, meaning they eat both producers' plants and consumers' animals. So then another part of the trophic levels is the detrivores and the decomposers. And the detrivores are things like millipedes and soil insects that scavenge the waste products or dead bodies of their community members. And then decomposers, such as fungi and bacteria, break down leaf litter and other non-living matter into simple constituents that can be taken up and used by plants. And here's just an example of the trophic levels. As we see, one important thing to note here is heat is lost at all levels, including the detrivores and the decomposers, even though they're a bit removed from the trophic levels. So energy, biomass, and numbers decrease at higher trophic levels, and that just kind of makes sense. A general rule of thumb is that each trophic level contains just 10% of the energy of the trophic level below it, and we can see it here in a nice example with very clean numbers. And again, energy will be lost at every level. So in the growth and production is the net primary production or the energy available to consumers. However, as the plant respires, energy is lost, and this is unavailable to consumers. And here's just yet another example of that. Just combining everything. We have the 1/10 rule, and then we have the heat loss on the right, and then even illustrating the heat loss from the detrivores and decomposers. And how does this relate to the second law of thermodynamics? Well, it states that energy, during any energy conversion, some energy is lost as heat. So as these things are growing, energy is lost. So when a deer eats a plant, energy is lost between the energy that goes into the plant and the energy that the deer gets from the plant. So then when we eat the deer, more energy is lost between how the deer grew, the energy required to grow the deer, so to say, and us eating it. So that's why growing crops to make meat is highly inefficient. So technically vegetarians do have a much smaller footprint than omnivores. And food webs are a way of showing feeding relationships and energy flow. As energy is transferred from lower trophic levels to higher ones, it is said to pass up a food chain, a linear series of feeding relationships. However, a more accurate representation of the feeding relationships in a community is a food web, a visual map of energy flow that uses arrows to show the many pathways along which energy passes as organisms consume one another. And this is definitely the more accurate one, where a food chain is just literally the energy going up a trophic level, which it does. The food web illustrates just the large amount of relationships a single community can have within itself. And again, trophic levels is never as simple as we think. Here's another very complex food web. And the implication you get is a very simple one. We'll maybe never be able to understand the exact relationships that exist, and humans are notorious for trying to simplify these things such as food chains, but we really can't. So in other words, we have no idea how our future actions can affect an ecosystem, and it's very difficult to ever predict the consequences of any action we have. And just going forward from here, some organisms play outsized roles in communities, so going with never being able to guess how our actions can affect an ecosystem it's very hard to even categorize what goes on in an ecosystem. There's certain species called keystone that have very strong and wide-reaching impact far out of proportion to its abundance. And like I said, these are called keystone species. And a great example of this is the otter. So the otter doesn't have a very large place in this ecosystem. There's not a ton of otters. But when the otters are there and feeding on the sea urchins don't overgraze the kelp. And if the kelp's not overgrazed, they can house fish, feed various other animals, and just have a very thriving ecosystem. However, when the sea otter is absent, the urchin population explodes, overgrazes the kelp, and nothing else can live in these kelp forests. So predators at high trophic levels can indirectly promote populations of organisms at the lower trophic levels by keeping species at intermediate trophic levels in check. This is a phenomenon ecologists refer to as trophic cascade. So animals at high trophic levels such as wolves, sea stars, sharks, and sea otters are often viewed as keystone species that can trigger trophic cascades. However, other type of organisms can also exert strong community-wide effects, and these type of organisms sometimes are called ecosystem engineers, and they physically modify the environment. And this is like beaver dams, prairie dogs, anthills, and the zebra mussels too. So less conspicuous organisms toward the bottom of food chains still may exert a lot of pressure themselves. So communities respond to disturbances in various ways. In ecological terms, a disturbance is an event that affects environmental conditions rapidly and drastically, resulting in changes to the community and ecosystem. And this can be from various things such as simple as a tree falling, or the removal of keystone species, and then just natural disturbances, or even human impacts. And a community that resists change and remains stable despite this disturbance is said to show resistance to the disturbance. Alternatively, a community may show resilience, meaning that it changes in response to the disturbance but later returns to its original state. And then it's also entirely possible a disturbed community may never ever return to its original state. So succession usually follows severe disturbances. If a disturbance is severe enough to eliminate all or most of the species in a community, the affected site may then undergo a somewhat predictable series of changes that ecologists call succession. And primary succession follows a disturbance so severe that no vegetation or soil life remains from the community that previously lived on the site. So the community is built from scratch. And this is in places such as glaciers, drying lakes, and volcanic lava. And a pioneer species then would be the first species to arrive, and these are usually lichens, mosses, and other plants that have wide dispersals and low nutrient needs. And here's an example of a lava flow, and as we can see, primary succession is already happening with this plant life here. Secondary succession, on the other hand, begins with a disturbance drastically alters an existing community, but does not destroy all living things or all organic matter in the soil. So processes of succession occur in a diversity of ecological systems, and the traditional view of succession described here, the process leads to a climax community which remains in place until some disturbance restarts succession. And here's an example going from primary, the grasses and the herbs and forbs, the secondary might be the shrubs and seedling, all the way to the climax community, the hardwoods here. An important thing to know is this is often cyclical. Very rarely will community last forever, and usually after some amount of time a disturbance will come by and reset a community to primary secondary succession. As I was saying, communities may undergo shifts. Today ecologists recognize that community change is far more variable and less predictable than early models of succession suggested. In addition, climax communities are not determined solely by climate, but vary with soil conditions and other factors from one time or place to another. Once the community is disturbed and changes are set in motion, there is no guarantee that the community will ever return to its original state. Sometimes communities may undergo a phase shift or regime shift in which the character of the community fundamentally changes. Many ecologists now think that human disturbances creating communities are wholly new and had not previously occurred on Earth. These novel communities, or no analog communities, are composed of novel mixtures of plants and animals and have no analog or precedent. And one part of this may be invasive species and how they pose new threats to community stability. In our age of global mobility and trade, people have moved countless organisms from place to place intentionally or even by accident, like the zebra mussel, such that today most non-native arrivals in the community are introduced species introduced by people. Most introduced species fail to establish populations in places they arrive, but some turn invasive, spreading widely and coming to dominate communities. Such invasive species often thrive in disturbed communities and in turn disturb them further. Introduced species may become invasive when limiting factors that regulate their population growth are absent in their original communities. Examples abound of invasive species that have had major ecological impacts. Ecologists generally view the impacts of invasive species and introduced species in general as overwhelmingly negative. Whatever view one takes, the impacts of invasive species on native species and ecological communities are significant, and they grow year by year with increasing mobility of people and the globalization of our society. And here's a couple of examples where the zebra and the quagga mussels in the Great Lakes, they're invasive species, and they've spread very rapidly in the 30 years they've been present. So we can respond to invasive species through control, eradication, or prevention. In 1990, the U.S. Congress passed legislation that led to the National Invasive Species Act of 1996. Since then, funding has become available for the control and eradication of invasive species, and also to prevent invasion. It helps to be able to predict where a given species might spread. And then altered communities, they can be restored. Because ecological systems support our civilization and all of life, when degraded systems cease to function, our health and welfare are being threatened. So this realization has given rise to the science of restoration ecology and the process of ecological restoration, or efforts to restore ecosystems to historical conditions before industrial civilization altered them. And then also this definition, historical conditions, can really vary depending on intent and what we want on the land. So it doesn't always have to be before industrialized civilization altered them. It could be even before that or after that. It really depends on the intent. And many ecological restoration efforts are underway today. There's a lot of prairie building restorations. And as our population grows and develops and spreads, ecological restoration is going to become increasingly vital. But restoration is very difficult. It's time-consuming, expensive, and it's not always successful. It is therefore best, whenever possible, just to go ahead and protect what we have rather than cleaning up afterwards. And a great example of this is the Everglades. Flood control and irrigation removed water, and it kind of stopped being a wetland, and that doesn't really roll too well with all the animals that live there. So some populations drop 9 to 95%, and it's going to take around 30 years and billions of dollars to restore this natural water flow if you want to conserve these species. And we do want to conserve these species. And here's a picture of a couple people looking at what appears to be wheat. So a biome is a major regional complex of similar communities. It's a large-scale ecological unit, and it's recognized primarily by its dominant plant type and vegetation structure. And here's just a photo of all the major biomes on the planet. And what you might notice is, even if they're all on separate continents, you can see temperate grassland occurs both on North America and in Europe and Asia. What you might notice is these climates and biomes usually occur near the same altitude, and we'll probably talk about it in a bit. So climate influences the location of biomes. Scientists often use climate diagrams or climatographs to depict indicators of an area's climate, such as temperature and precipitation. And then global climate patterns cause biomes to occur in large patches in different parts of the world. So like I was saying, usually you get similar climates along the same altitude, so we can get similar biomes despite being across the world. And here's just a neat infographic showing the relationship between precipitation and temperature. So if you have very hot temperature and dry precipitation, you'll be left with a desert. And then on the other hand, we have the tundra where it's very wet but very cold. Both types of deserts, though. And then aquatic and coastal systems, they also resemble biomes. It's very similar, it's just in the ocean. Areas equivalent to biomes also exist in the oceans. They exist along coasts and in freshwater systems. However, unlike the terrestrial biomes, they're not shaped by the air temperature and precipitation, but by water temperature, salinity, nutrients, wave actions, and a lot of other variables. So we can divide the world into 10 terrestrial biomes, so I'm going to go over all of them a little briefly right here. Excuse me. Temperature deciduous forest dominates the landscape around the central and southern Great Lakes, and it's characterized by broadleaf trees that are deciduous, meaning that they lose their leaves each fall and remain dormant during winter. when hard freezes would endanger leaves. There is even year-round precipitation, fertile soils, and it's often characterized by oak, beech, and maple. And here's a photo of just a photo of temperate deciduous forest. On the right here, we can see moist conditions all year round, very mild summers, pretty cold winters. So temperate grasslands, on the other hand, traveling westward from the Great Lakes, temperatures differences between winter and summer become even more extreme. Rainfall diminishes, and we'll find temperate grasslands, also known as steppe or prairie. And here we see that. On its precipitation graph, we can see they actually experience dry conditions during the summer. So it's not wet all year round, and there's definitely a difference, a larger difference between winter and summer here. The coastal Pacific Northwest region with its heavy rainfall features temperate rainforests. The soils of temperate rainforests are usually quite fertile, but they're susceptible to landscapes and erosion, and forests are cleared to extract lumber and commercially valuable forest products. So this time we see an even larger amount of precipitation all year round. This is in Nagasaki, Japan, actually, and here's a photo of a temperate rainforest. Tropical rainforest, on the other hand, is found normally in Central America, South America, Southeast Asia, West Africa, and various other tropical regions, and is characterized by year-round rain and uniformly warm temperatures. So tropical rainforests have dark, damp interiors, lush vegetation, and highly diverse biotic communities, with more species of insects, birds, amphibians, and other animals than any other biome in the world. And as you can see on its climate graph here, the precipitation year-round, however, the temperature is not variable, and it's just very warm throughout the year. And we have a photo right there, tropical rainforest. Tropical areas that are warm year-round, but where rainfall is lower overall and highly seasonal, give rise to the tropical dry forest or tropical deciduous forest, a biome widespread in India, Africa, South America, and northern Australia. And here again we see, we have again a very average normal temperature, warm temperature throughout the year. However, instead of precipitation all year, we have a drier tropical regions give rise to savanna, tropical grassland interspersed with clusters of acacias or other trees. The savanna biome is found across stretches of Africa, South America, Australia, India, and other dry tropical regions. And this is where we see zebras, gazelles, giraffes, lions, and hyenas. And again, it's very similar to the tropical deciduous forest in that it has a dry and wet season, and it's very warm. So then moving on to deserts, where rainfall is very sparse, a desert can form. The driest biome on Earth, most deserts receive well under 9.8 inches of precipitation per year, and much of it is during isolated months or maybe even years apart. Some deserts, such as Africa's Sahara and Namib deserts, are mostly bare and sand dunes. Others, such as the Sonoran deserts of Arizona and northwest Mexico, receive more rain and are more heavily vegetated. Desert soils can be quite saline and are sometimes known as lithosoils or stone soils for their high mineral and low organic matter content. And here you see it's just dry conditions all year long, and there is variable temperature throughout the year, and it just goes from less hot to hot. Nearly as dry as desert, tundra occurs at very high latitudes in northern Russia, Canada, and Scandinavia. Extremely cold winters with little daylight and summers with lengthy days characterize the landscapes of lichens and low, scrubby vegetation without trees. Because of the cold climate, underground soil remains more or less permanently frozen, and this is called permafrost. So there's tundra. They do have wet seasons, and there are variable temperatures, a little bit unlike the desert. So where the desert is warm and dry, this is cold and wet. The northern coniferous forest, or boreal forest, often called the taiga, extends across much of Canada, Alaska, Russia, and Scandinavia. These forests develop in cooler and drier regions to temperate forests, and they experience long, cold winters and short, cool summers. And we can see this on the graph. And then the last one we're going to talk about is called the chaparral. In contrast to the boreal forest's broad continuous distribution, the chaparral is limited to small patches influenced by the ocean, like the Mediterranean, and widely found across the globe. Chaparral consists mostly of evergreen shrubs and is densely thicketed. And these are often characterized by their dry summers and their wet winters. These are just what you think of Mediterranean climates like Italy. They exist chaparral in Australia, I believe even California. So altitudes, they create patterns analogous to latitudinal temperatures. So as you know, if you go northern along the latitude lines, it gets colder. Same thing applies to altitude. I believe it's 6 degrees Celsius for every 1,000 meters in altitude. And vegetative communities will change along mountain slopes in correspondence with the altitude-induced climate variation. At higher altitudes, temperature, atmospheric pressure, and oxygen all decline, whereas the ultraviolet radiation there will increase. Moreover, mountains can alter local climate in other ways too, such as through the rain shadow effect, and this is when moisture-laden air ascends up a steep slope. It releases precipitation as it cools, but by the time it flows over the top of the mountain down the other side, it becomes very dry, creating a relatively arid region in the rain shadow. And here's just all the different communities you get as you increase in elevation. So the temperature is just getting colder as it goes up, which changes the community of species present. So in conclusion, the natural world is very complex, and we can visualize it in many ways and at various scales. And dividing the world's communities into major types or biomes is informative at the broadest geographic scales. And understanding how communities function at more local scale requires an understanding of how the species might interact with one another. And just increasingly, humans are altering communities. And ecological restoration attempts to undo the negative changes that we have caused is in response to us altering these many communities. So that's going to be it for lecture 4.